Hello, everybody. This is Charlie, your commie preacher. Thank you for coming to another Church of the Revolution video, or if this is your very first time, welcome to the channel. We are here at the Church of the Revolution. We preach that Jesus was a communist, and from that, we are aiming to transform both the religious and the political landscape of our world, and in particular here in the United States. So today I'm going to preach a message that you probably would already expect me to preach, perhaps, and that is hell is for the rich. What do I mean by that? Well, stay tuned and find out. If you are new to the channel, please hit subscribe and set yourself up to get the notifications. Also, in the information of the video, I have links to my link tree and to my other projects here on the internet. I have a Facebook group and a Facebook page for the Church of the Revolution. We're trying to create a hybrid online community that is hybrid online and in real life, hybrid both. And hopefully once the pandemic conditions allow, we'll begin doing in-person events in the city of Chicago. But if you would like me to come to your area, either virtually or in person, let me know. I am always eager to do that. So today we're going to talk about hell is for the rich. What in the world does that mean? It's fairly simple. When I was growing up, I was a Pentecostal preacher's kid, and just like almost any Pentecostal preacher's kid, I was terrified of hell. What I had been taught is that if I didn't believe the right things, and if I hadn't confessed every single one of my sins, every dirty word I've ever said, every dirty thought I ever had, every violent thought I've ever had, if I had not repented, every disobedient thought towards my parent, if I hadn't confessed every single one of my sins, I was going to die and go to hell if I left anything unconfessed, or if I disbelieved any of the orthodox ideas about Jesus and how you know, who he was, why he died, what his salvation was about, and so on. If I didn't believe those things, I was going to go to hell. Well, as I grew up, I discovered that it really was wrong. That whole construct was completely wrong. And I'm going to dip into somebody else's story first. And this guy is by the name of Reverend Jim Wallace. He is the founder of Sojourners Magazine in Washington, D.C. He, like me, was raised in a hellfire and brimstone tradition known as the Plymouth Brethren. And they taught very similar doctrines to what I did, although they did believe in something called eternal security. That is, they didn't believe you could lose your salvation once you had it. But I lived in terror of constantly losing my salvation. But Jim Wallace, he grew up, I believe, in Michigan, and he went to the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor as a young adult, and he decided that he could no longer stomach the white racism that he had grown up in the church that he had, and he became a left-wing Students for a Democratic Society member and participated in a number of activities to try to change the world. And he wrote a memoir about this time in his life called Revive Us Again, a Sojourner Story. I'm not going to show you the cover because my camera's reversed. But if I can figure out how to do it, I'll try to snap a picture into this video. One of these days, I'm going to get my technology act together. In fact, I've got a computer sitting over here that's almost ready to go. Almost. I need a few more technological tweaks to be ready to, to be in full business as I want to do here with the Church of the Revolution. So I'm going to read here from page 73 in the book Revive Us Again by Jim Wallace. Jim says, I have long been searching for something that would transform both political and personal life. The movement, the Students for a Democratic Society and the left-wing 1960s New Left, the movement had been a significant part of my formation, my home, for several years, but no longer did it have the answers to my deepest longings and questions. And this realization took me back to the New Testament. I read through the gospel narratives and the parables in which Jesus describes the ways that God's new order, what we call here the divine regime, might become real in the lives of men and women during the political turmoil of the first century, Roman-occupied Palestine. The gospel story captured my imagination, and all of my excitement about the new life I was discovering culminated for me when I read Matthew 25:31-46. So we get a story of hell from Orthodox, or I shouldn't say, from conservative evangelical Christianity, which I think to some degree is even prevalent in some quarters of the Catholic Church. This idea that if you aren't going to confession regularly, if you aren't taking the sacrament, you could end up in a tormenting, eternal, fiery hole called hell forever, literally forever. Jillions and jillions and uncountable gazillions of years longer than you've been alive. God hates sin and disbelief so much that he's going to torment most human beings. And that's the Orthodox, that's the evangelical reading. Most people aren't going to make it to hell. Only a tiny little minority who are pure enough are going to make it into heaven. And on its face, that, how do you square that doctrine with the idea that God loves everyone that he created? If that's love, sending most of humanity to hell, if that's love, excuse my French, fuck that kind of love. So let's talk about the story of hell, in particular, how it plays out in the Gospel of Matthew. And of course, my tablet decides to go to sleep just as I'm about to read from it. So we're going to start here in verse 31 of Matthew 25, and I use, for most purposes, I use what's known as the inclusive translation, but I paraphrase it as I go, because no translation is fully communist enough for me. One of these days, I'll have to print at least the version of the Gospel of Luke that, I believe makes sense. Verse 31, at the appointed time, the promised one. In most translations, that promised one is Son of Man, but the inclusive is, of course, not going to talk about man, not going to talk about son. The promised one will come in glory, escorted by all the angels of the universe, and will sit upon a throne, and all the nations assembled below that throne. Then the promised one will separate them from one another as a shepherd divides the sheep from the goats. The sheep will be placed on the right hand, the goats on the left. The ruler will then say to those on the right, come, blessed of my Abba, God, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the creation of the world, for I was hungry, and you fed me. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. Naked, and you clothed me. I was ill, and you comforted me. In prison, and you came to visit me. And then these will ask, when did we see you hungry and feed you? Or see you thirsty and give you drink? When did we see you as a stranger and invite you in, or clothe you in your nakedness? When did we see you ill or in prison and come to visit you? And the ruler will answer them, the truth is, every time you did this for the least of my sisters, brothers, and siblings, you did it for me. Then the ruler will say to those on the left, out of my sight, you accursed ones, into that everlasting fire prepared for the devil and fallen angels. I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, you gave me no welcome. Naked, you gave me no clothing. I was ill and in prison, and you did not come to visit me. Then they in turn will ask, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or homeless or naked or ill or in prison and not take care of you? And the answer will come, the truth is, as often as you neglected to do this to one of the least of these, you neglected to do it to me. And they will go off to eternal punishment, and the just will go off to eternal life. I got a lot to say. There's a lot to unpack in that passage. I would say essentially almost every important theme in theology, every single one gets touched on in this passage. I call this a microcosm of the eschatology of Jesus. Now, did Jesus actually say this? There's some doubt. But I would say that every element of this particular passage occurs in other parts of the gospel. So in a sense, this is an attempt to create a summary, but put it in the mouth of Jesus by a gospel writer. And it's a pretty impressive summary. So let's dig into this a bit. At the appointed time, So, without getting too much into the Greek, that appointed time when Jesus, the promised one, and it's not necessarily Jesus, you notice that it's the promised one or the Son of Man. Is Jesus the Son of Man? Well, he uses that term to talk about himself, but remembering that this is not probably his exact words, it was chosen for him because Son of Man refers in the prophecy of Daniel refers to the Messiah, to the arriving judge of humanity. And this is what this passage is referencing. And it says at the appointed time. When is that? It says at the end of, in a sense, it's at the end of history. Let's talk about the end of history, and let's bring in here Marxism. Why Marxism? Well, because Marxism is the most systematically elaborated understanding of communism. It's not necessarily the final, and it's not perfect. Marxism has limitations. It doesn't have a complete theory of religion, which is why something like the Church of the Revolution has to come into being to sort of fill out things that Marx, because he was who he was, a man of his time, didn't quite get about religion, about the radical potential of religion. You can listen to my other videos, and I talk about some of that, particularly the last video on the opiates of the opium of the people. Why am I bringing in Marx here? Because Marx makes this claim that after studying Hegel, after being exposed to French communism during one of the uprisings in France, being exposed to the communism as it was emerging in Germany, he sort of took Hegel, and what Hegel gave was a master theory of history, right? It's what's called the dialectics of history. He and particularly he did it with philosophy, how there's an idea, and then there's a challenge to that idea, which he called the antithesis. So there's thesis, antithesis, and then there is a synthesis, a new idea. Now, this is a great oversimplification of what Hegel was trying to get across, but remembering these three things, that ideas contradict one another, but not only that, Marx said not only ideas, but practice. Economic practices contradict each other and give rise to situations of conflict and revolution. And Marx, taking this sort of Hegelian read of the past and begins to project it forward. Where is the contradiction now within the order of society that will lead us to the next stage? Because what we had during the time of Marx, that was a culmination of a process that had been going back quite a while. It definitely was going on in the 1700s when you had the American Revolution. It had gone on in the 1600s in England with the English Revolution, the Glorious Revolution, the various attempts to overthrow the monarchy and the eventual compromise of a constitutional monarchy. Although here in the United States, we completely dissociate ourselves from the British monarchy. These revolutions had all been going on prior to Marx and were reaching a certain culminating point in Marx's time. And he, using the philosophy of Hegel, which is looking to the future, said, well, what's the next stage? After this democratic revolutions, these bourgeois, he called them bourgeois, which means, upper middle class, the wealthy class is the bourgeois class, and they revolted against the aristocracy, who were the previous wealthy class, and displaced them. And this is why we had these revolutions in Western Europe in particular. And so Marx said, well, we're going to move beyond capitalism and beyond this sort of representative democracy to a revolutionary socialism and a revolutionary understanding of democracy. And that will usher in the era of communism. So when it says at the appointed time, the promised one, this Son of Man figure, will come in glory, this is the culmination of history. This is what I would argue is the doorway to communism. It is describing the doorway to communism in the teachings of Jesus. The return of Jesus, which I don't take in any literal sense. I think the return of Jesus is simply going to be the emergence of this messianic, communistic, revolutionary spirit in a global sense. And we have not seen that yet. We have seen almost a century and a half, almost 2 centuries of Marxism attempting to be the communism that transforms the whole world. And believe me, the achievements, particularly of the Leninist tradition, what happened in Bolshevik Russia, what happened in China, what happened in Vietnam, Cuba, all of these are a stunning attempt to make communism the new global order. But as we know, in the 1990s and the latter 80s, the Soviet Union collapsed, and all of the Eastern European communist regimes collapsed, and a number of other regimes, communist regimes, collapsed. China's still there, Vietnam and Cuba, they're still there, but they face increasing pressure from this newly triumphant capitalism. So Jesus coming back, if you will, and what I mean by that is the messianic spirit achieving its fulfillment in history, comes back escorted by all of the angels of heaven, which are the messengers, which are the task, the beings, that spiritual beings that do the work of the divine will. All the nations are assembled before the throne of the promised one. I want to key on that word nations, because often this passage and evangelical eschatology says that Jesus is all about individual salvation and is not about politics. And yet right here, in one of the few extensive descriptions of the final judgment that we have anywhere in the Gospels, this is even more detailed than what you have in the the book of Revelation, although there is similar kinds of things going on there, but it doesn't specifically mention the hungry, the thirsty, the naked, the stranger. It doesn't mention those categories. Not because they're unimportant, but because Revelation had a different read on the eschatology. And I will dig into Revelation. But Matthew's gospel puts these words into the mouth of Jesus because the person who was compiling this gospel believed this was the best way to summarize the eschatology of Jesus. And so the nations are called before Jesus to account for what? How they treated the hungry, how they treated the thirsty, how they treated the stranger, which means the foreigner. How did they treat the naked? How did they treat the sick? How did they treat the prisoner? These nations are being judged for this. It's not individual judgment. I hope that didn't come through. It probably didn't. So what I want to emphasize is that this story, which is really a prophecy in the Gospel of Mark, a kind of apocalypse, if you will, if you map that on to this sort of Marxist Hegelian theory of where the future and humanity is going, and Marxist theory and Hegelian theory actually probes the deep past, and we're going to talk about that. We'll talk about the deep past before I finish working on Matthew 25. The nations of the world are going to be judged according to how they treat the hungry and thirsty. That is what this passage is saying. And they're judged by who? The angels and by God. They're not judged by human beings, but they're judged by, in a sense, the invisible forces of the cosmos. And I believe that the way to understand that the angels, the way to understand it says, "Come, you blessed of my Abba God," God as parent, God as Papa, Mama. God, inherit the kingdom prepared for you, those nations which have done a good job of caring for the hungry, the thirsty, the naked, the stranger, the poor. Those nations are going to come into a kingdom, a regime prepared from the creation of the world. Marxism talks about primitive communism, right? This ancient period where we were hunters and gatherers and horticulturalists. We had gardening. We did not have farms. We didn't have enslavement. We didn't have hierarchies of, wealthy and poor or powerful and weak. It was a family, except everybody lived in a more or less extended family. And there was no enormous there was no systemic structural economic deprivation going on. And that emerged in the next period of history. So when this passage harkens back and says, inherit the kingdom or the regime prepared for you since the emergence, the evolution of your species on this planet, I think that that's an enormously optimistic message. It says that it is in human nature. Human nature was designed for communism. Primitive communism will be transformed into heavenly or universal communism, a kind of communism we haven't seen, but that is our latent potential. Humanity is all potentially communistic, every single human being. Let's talk about this. Hell is for the rich, all right? So Jesus says, or the ruler says, again, not sure that this is Jesus, says to those on the left, out of my sight, you accursed ones, into that everlasting fire prepared for the devil and the fallen angels. Without getting too deep into who the devil is and who the fallen angels are, let's just say they are their oppression. They are the potential of this humanity, which was created to be cooperative and benevolent. But then, in the agriculture era, this emerging hierarchy of the wealthy and powerful, that is the devil and his angels doing their work to pervert the original potential of humanity and to siphon off the best of humanity and to dehumanize the rest. So it says, into an everlasting fire. So the word everlasting is an interesting word there. It's a Greek word, is aionion, and it occurs twice in this passage. And people act as if they know what eternal means, if infinite means, and this is where the idea that hell is an infinite, fiery pit where we burn for our sins. First of all, if there was an infinite, eternal, fiery pit, it would be rich people who would be in it. Nations. But remember, we're saying that this is a collective judgment of the nations. And so I believe that the nations that fail to care for the poor, they will be destroyed as nations. And maybe individuals within that nation can be gathered into the future arrival of socialism and communism here on earth. So the idea that there's an eternal torment pit for even the rich, I don't take it literally. The rich deserve to lose everything, and Jesus says that multiple times. He says, if you want to be, this rich young guy, if you want to follow me and join in my mission, sell everything you have and give it to the poor. It's unwavering that eternal punishment is for the rich, but notice that it's really in this passage for the rich nations. It's not for rich as individuals. But there's one more clue here to this eschatology, and that comes in a phrase that Jesus uses a few times in different gospels. The first will be last, the last will be first. The first are the rich and powerful. They will be sent to the end of the line. And according to this passage, they will suffer. It says eternal, but again, this word aionion does not literally mean eternal. It means final. It means ultimate. It means the finishing, the completing punishment, that the rich have to go through a punishment before they get into this communism. And I believe, we're going to, the Soviet Union was notorious for locking people up, as was the Chinese, the Maoist regime was notorious for locking up rich people. And of course, some communist regimes just slaughtered them as wholesale as they possibly could, particularly Pol Pot. But in here, I think the idea that the rich are going to be consciously tormented forever, or that the sinners, let's go back to the evangelical version of this, is that the sinners are going to be tormented forever consciously. One, that's incompatible with the God of love. So that must not be what the word aionian. It doesn't mean eternal. I like to believe it means the final, the completing chastisement or transformation of the rich into communists. And, just like the Soviet Union's re-education camps. The rich nations are destroyed, and so, but the rich people need to become fit citizens for our new communist regime, and so they have to undergo chastisement, punishment, correction. And we will do this scientifically, we will do it rationally. We won't just lock people up forever just to get them out of the way. We will actually undertake a reforming work as we develop our ability to help people with their negative antisocial behaviors. I really believe we already have the tools in modern psychology and modern, counseling. We can help people much better than we used to with really antisocial behaviors. And if anybody is guilty of antisocial behavior, it's these rich people. So ultimately, I don't believe in an eternal torment for anybody. I do believe in the destruction of the rich nations. But even in the book of Revelation, it says that all of the glories of every nation will enter into the New Jerusalem. The New Jerusalem is another symbol for this communist era that is coming on earth. This video has been 26 minutes, and I like to cut them off around 30 minutes. I hope that this has helped you understand why I am so dogmatic in saying Jesus was a communist. Because in this passage alone, you can ignore every other passage in the Gospels. If you just base your theology on this one passage, you get to the idea that Jesus was preaching communism, was preaching the destruction of the wealthy nations, the elevation of the nations that had cared for the poor, and the creation of a global order, which he called eternal. They will go off to eternal punishment. The rest will go off to eternal life, which just means a completed, fulfilled, transformed life. That is the message of Jesus as summarized in Matthew 25. And yes, there are parables that sound like Jesus supports certain kinds of capitalism, or at least certain types of bartering and market-based economy. And maybe someday I'll deal with those directly. But what I want to get out today, as I'm doing a video for the first time in a few weeks, is to get this message on recording and get it out to everyone. So again, subscribe, get your notifications, check out the links in my bio, and let's work together to create a true Church of the Revolution on earth, because hell is for the rich and heaven, communism, is for the poor.